slammed my shoulder into the door so hard the whole frame shuddered and dust rained down like a bad omen. My name is Vivian Hale, and the house I'd inherited from a man I barely knew answered me with silence. The will was in my pocket, every account, every acre, every photograph of smiling faces. Everything left to me except the locked room at the end of the hall. The one place no one spoke about. I hit the door again. Pain flared up my arm, hot and honest. Why leave me everything but this? Why carve out one dark corner and hand me the rest like a mercy? My grandmother used to tug my sleeve when we passed this corridor, her eyes pleading without words. My grandfather's hand on my shoulder the day he taught me to refuse curiosity, his voice a low command, never open what is not given to you. I had always obeyed. Until now. I found a hammer in the kitchen drawer and climbed the stairs like a woman going to trial. Each step thudded beneath me like a warning. The hammer struck and rang against something hard. Metal. Reinforcement. He didn't lock it. He armored it. I kept hitting until the wood cracked and a hidden plate gave up with a sound like an old man sighing. The lock snapped. The door opened on darkness that felt like a mouth. My phone flashlight carved a thin beam into the black and landed on a table with one open journal on it. My grandfather's handwriting. The ink deliberate. The date, the week I was born. The heir must know who destroyed this family and who must answer for it. My throat closed. Pages skimmed under my fingers and revealed names. My family's names. Dates, amounts, meetings, promises made and broken. Photographs slipped out. My father, younger, laughing beside a stranger I didn't know, smoke curling behind them from the left wing of the mansion. The first lie, written in red. All the stories I'd been told started to fray. Accidents that looked too neat. Consolations that felt rehearsed. Memory is a loyal thing until you hold evidence in your hands, and it refuses to line up. A noise in the hallway made me spin. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. A silhouette darkened the threshold, and the smell of cedar and old funeral cologne wrapped around him. He stepped in and the light struck a face I knew from the edges of family gatherings. My grandfather's right hand. The man who had always smiled too easily at funerals. So you finally found the room, Vivian. Why did he write my name? I asked. He moved closer, palms folded. Your grandfather kept a ledger. He believed the family needed a surgeon. Someone to prune what would rot the line. He recorded offenses like a physician marks infection. He wanted an heir who could wield knowledge like a scalpel. My heartbeat skidded. Prune? That's what you call breaking people. Sometimes he used the word mercy. Sometimes prevention. Remove one diseased branch so the rest might flourish. The journals are full of methods. Financial ruin. Public shaming. Carefully arranged exiles. Death was not always necessary. Sometimes erasure by law and rumor was crueler and cleaner. My mouth went dry. So my father. What did the ledger say about him? It records everything. Your father appears in a photograph at the fire, hands clenched around an envelope. Some notes say he was bribed. Others say he was coerced. Your grandfather wrote both. He hated ambiguity. He wanted the next voice to decide. Decide what? Decide who is guilty? Who must be punished? Yes, the heir must choose. Read, and then decide whether to wield the ledger or burn it. The words landed like a cold stone. I could imagine condemning the men who profited, exposing liars until their names burned. But I could also imagine what that machine did to people when my grandfather used it. Families broken. Lives made small. The ledger didn't repair. It consumed. So what happens if I refuse? Refusal is a choice. The ledger has ways to make choices for you. Anger rose hot and foul. You made this. You wrote the rules. You enforced them. He stepped closer. You can walk away. Slam the door, sign the papers, keep the wealth and let the past be cold as stone. Or you can sit at the table tonight and hear the guests toast the family name. The ledger expects your first ruling tonight. I looked at the photograph of my father, smoke half swallowing his grin. I need time. Time runs different here. Read. Learn. Decide. But remember, decisions have a way of deciding back. I sat on the cold floor surrounded by journals that glinted like teeth. I picked up the nearest one and began to read. If the past had been cataloged and weaponized, then the only way out was through. I flipped pages until my fingers went numb. Then the fire carved itself into ledger ink with a date that made my stomach drop. June 14th. The entry was neat, clinical. The left wing would be decommissioned. Insurance claims prepared. Partners compensated. Scrawled beneath, in my grandfather's tighter hand, collusion, profit, silence paid. I read names until they blurred. My father's was there, yes, but alongside it were the names of cousins I'd spent holidays with, of accountants who smiled at reunions, of a developer who bought property like a man collecting trophies. The ledger didn't moralize. It annotated. It put everything on the scale and waited for a hand to tip it. My head ached. So they burned the wing on purpose. They used the fire to cover their theft. The man who had stood in the doorway earlier now sat back, as if he'd expected me to scream. Instead, I felt eerily calm. Numbness threaded with a cold, terrible clarity. "What did you expect?" he asked. "Did you think your grandfather let fate decide?" I wanted to throw the journal at him, but my hands trembled too much. Why did he document everything? Why keep a ledger of pain? Because some men don't trust memory. They trust proof. He wanted anyone who came after to understand how every choice bent the family. Toward ruin or toward survival. He wanted the successor to have a map. A map. A weapon. A sentence. I read about meetings in basements, about envelopes passed under tablecloths, about whispered deals made with the assurance that paper would keep their secrets. And then I read about consequences. Small at first. A whispered rumor. A contract quietly voided. A business deal collapsing like a house of cards. Later, harsher measures. Properties quietly transferred. Reputations dismantled. Lines of credit frozen until men were left with nothing but their names. And there it was. My grandfather's admission, a paragraph marked with a red cross. I ordered the exile of a cousin who dared challenge the plan. I arranged for his business to fail. He left his family with nothing. He learned to beg. He never returned. The ledger was an anatomy of cruelty disguised as stewardship. I slammed the book shut because the image of my father, hand clenched around an envelope, had become unbearable. If they profited, if they lied, why not go to the police? Why choose this legal murder of livelihoods? The man watched me with a funny, almost sad kindness. The police take evidence and hand it to the state. The ledger returns judgment to the family. Your grandfather believed that public law heals nothing that family power cannot control. He wanted the family to be its own judge. My laugh was half a sob. That's not justice. That's vigilantism. That's cowardice dressed in a suit. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's a way to survive when the world outside would eat you alive. He folded his hands as if closing a sermon. You can hate the method and still see why it grew. A car horn honked distantly, a mundane sound from a world that had no inked pages about it. I thought of my mother sitting at the breakfast table with a cup of tea, humming low, the small rituals that meant home. How did those small mercies fit into a ledger that measured debt? You start where the ledger tells you, the man said. You begin with the first lie. I stood, voice taut. Tell me every name tied to June 14th. Give me the dates, the transactions. I will look, and I will decide. He nodded and began to list. Names fell like pebbles into a pond. Clara Hale. Evan Drayton. Mallory and Company. A developer named Reed. Each with a shorthand note. Transfer. Loss. Lien. Each name mapped back to a set of transactions that made sense only in ink. The pattern stitched itself into a kind of grotesque wallpaper. Opportunity, motive, cover. My chest tightened with each name because each name was a person I'd hugged, a laugh I'd shared. The ledger turned faces into variables and variables into verdicts. When he paused, I realized the light was shifting. Day bleeding toward evening. The manor hummed with preparations I hadn't known about. Someone was setting the table in the dining room with plates I recognized from childhood. Thin porcelain with a family crest. The thought of eating from that same set while carrying the knowledge of who'd stolen bread from beneath the house felt obscene. You can confront them tonight, he said. Or you can wait until you have more. But know this. The ledger's clock ticks faster than a woman's comfort. The family will test you either way. I walked to the window and looked out at the drive where cars would soon gather. The oaks outside threw long fingers of shadow. The property seemed to hold its breath. I felt small and enormous at once. An heir with a choice that could rewrite more than ledgers. My hands reached for the journal again and I wrote, with a shaking hand, a list of what I needed. Proof of ownership transfers. The developer's contracts. Copies of disputed ledgers. Witnesses who might recant or confirm. The scattered receipts of bribes if they existed. I was becoming methodical because the ledger demanded it of me. If I was to use the same tools, I would at least use them with better intent. "You're making a plan," he said, and there was a note of approval that didn't sit well on my skin. "I'll need allies. People who remember things differently. People who aren't carved into ledger entries yet. People who will stand when I speak." "Who do you trust?" he asked. My mouth opened and closed like a trapped thing. Trust felt like a currency I had spent foolishly in childhood. But names came. My cousin Mira, whose laugh hid a fierce temper. Old Mrs. Padmore, the housekeeper who'd been here longer than the family knew. A lawyer named Simone who once tutored me on contracts and hated the idea of family power. "Choose wisely," he said. "Allies can protect you or sell you out." I tucked the journal under my arm and breathed, the air inside the archive tasting like destiny and dust. The dining room clock chimed. For slow, resonant notes that sounded like a call to war. Tonight, the family would gather. Tonight, I would decide whether to be the surgeon my grandfather hoped for or the heir who cut the instruments and burned the book. I walked out of the room with the ledger pressed to my chest like a beating thing, and the house watched me go. Every portrait seeming to catalog my passing. I was not the same Vivian who had come upstairs trembling. The ledger had opened and I had looked. Now it expected motion. I paused at the top of the stairs, listening to the hum of china downstairs, voices I could not yet hear. I whispered, not sure if I was praying or planning. "If I have to choose who to save and who to burn, let me choose in a way that ends the ledger." The stairs creaked under my weight, and as I descended, the house seemed to lean toward me, as if it wanted to know which way I would swing the knife. The dining room glittered with crystal and lies. Faces turned toward me as I entered. Smiling. Expectant. My mother sat at the far end, her hands folded neatly, her eyes searching mine for some sign of what I'd become. Uncle Evan rose with a glass already in hand, ready to toast the new heir. I didn't let him start. I set the ledger on the table with a sound like a gavel falling. The room went silent. "Good evening," I said quietly. "I found grandfather's gift." Evan's smile faltered. "Vivian, that's not something for." "The left wing wasn't an accident," I said, my voice cutting clean through his. "It was arson. For profit. And I know every name tied to it." The room exploded. Voices colliding. Chairs scraping. Silverware clattering like weapons dropped in panic. Evan shot to his feet so fast his wine splashed across the tablecloth like blood. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing." He stepped toward me, but my mother moved faster, slipping between us with a ferocity I hadn't seen since childhood. Her voice trembled, but her stance didn't. "Evan, sit down." "You have no authority here," he snapped. "I have more than you think," she answered quietly. He laughed, a sound edged with panic. "You? The ledger has your name, your sins, your debts. If you think your daughter can protect you." I slammed the ledger shut so hard the chandelier rattled above us. "Say another word against her, and I will read your page aloud." Silence. The kind of silence that punctures lungs. Evan's nostrils flared, but he sat. My hands shook as I placed the ledger in front of me. The pages fanned slightly, as though the book itself was gasping, tasting the chaos it had created for decades. The room watched me like I held a detonator. And maybe I did. I took a breath that scraped my ribs raw. This book destroyed more of us than outsiders ever could. It turned our family into spies and saboteurs. It taught us to hide, not heal. And I refused to inherit that. My cousin Clara leaned forward, her voice a hiss. "So what? You throw the ledger out and pretend it's all forgiven?" "Vivian, people died for the balance he kept. We stayed safe because he was willing to do what others couldn't." "Safe? I repeated, my voice rising. You call this safe? You call blackmail and fear tradition? You call exile justice? Her jaw flexed, but she said nothing. I opened the ledger again. Slowly. Pages whispered like ghosts waking. The left wing wasn't an accident. It was a scheme. And I know every name tied to it. Gasps rippled again. Uncle Evan's fingers clenched around the stem of his glass. You'll tear this family apart if you say those names. No, I whispered. You tore it apart the night you lit the match. A ripple of shock shot through the room. My mother's breath hitched sharply. She hadn't known. She clamped a hand over her mouth. Evan, please tell me she's lying. Evan froze, the color draining from his face. His silence was an answer more damning than any confession. Murmurs turned to accusations. Clara whispering violently into her husband's ear. An aunt clutching her pearls as if jewelry could shield her. Two cousins shooting up from their seats like cornered animals. I raised my voice before the room could spiral into fists and blame. I'm not naming names tonight. Evan snarled, because you don't have the proof you think you do. No. I looked at him with a calm that felt foreign. Because the ledger ends with me. Someone shouted, then what's the point of this? I let out a shaky breath. To give every one of you a choice. A choice. Clara spat. What choice do we have? The choice, I said slowly, to confess before I do. To tell the truth you buried. To face each other, not the ledger. Laughter broke from the far end of the table. Dry. Cold. Unraveling. It was Uncle Reed, the developer whose name I'd seen scribbled beside dirty transactions. Vivian, you sweet idealist. You think truth cleans anything? No. Truth destroys. That's why your grandfather handled it in shadows. And look what shadows did, I shot back. Look at us. This room full of strangers pretending to be family. Reed raised his glass in a mocking toast. Cheers to that. I didn't drink. The chandelier light flickered above us like it was struggling to stay alive. You want the truth? Reed asked, leaning back. Fine. I profited from the fire. Evan profited more. Your father tried to stop it and failed. Your mother took money to keep you alive. Everyone in this room has ink on their hands. And without the ledger, the only thing that kept us aligned, fear, dies. My stomach twisted. If fear is what keeps us together, then we're not a family. We're a cartel wearing Sunday clothes. He smirked. Welcome to adulthood, heir. My hands curled into fists. I'm not inheriting a crime ring. Then it will eat you alive, he said. Something inside me snapped. Quietly. Cleanly. Not if I starve it first. I turned the ledger toward me. The parchment felt heavier than bone. I squared my shoulders and met the gaze of every person at that cursed table. I'm burning this. Voices erupted instantly. Shouts. Protests. Threats. You can't. It's our history. You'll destroy us. You have no right. I have every right. My voice cracked like thunder. He named me heir. He put this book in my hands. So I decide what we become next. Evan lunged halfway across the table, fingers stabbing the air. You burn that ledger and everything collapses. Alliances. Protections. Arrangements. Good, I whispered. He froze. Maybe it should collapse. Clara shook her head violently. You'll ruin us all. No, I said softly. You ruined yourselves the day you chose profit over blood. A chair fell over as someone stood suddenly. Another cousin stormed out. An aunt fainted. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for me, whispering, Vivian, please be careful. The man who had stood in the archive room earlier appeared now in the doorway. My grandfather's old executor. His eyes unreadable. He watched the chaos unfold without blinking, as if this moment had been scripted long before I was born. I looked at him. You knew this would happen. He nodded once. The ledger always ends one of two ways. Silence or fire. And I choose fire, I said. His lips curved into something like approval. Or warning. The room erupted again. But this time, not in anger. In fear. Pure, visceral fear. Because they saw it. They saw the way I held the ledger. They saw the way resolve had settled into my bones. They saw the hail air they never expected. Not a continuation of the old tyrant, but a rebellion wearing his name. I lifted the ledger. The room held its breath. "I will burn this book," I said quietly. "And then every one of you will face the truth without a cage to hide in." A woman whispered, horrified, "What will happen to us?" I looked around the table at the trembling faces, at people who had lived decades ruled by secrets and fear. "What happens next," I said, "depends on whether you want to be a family again or stay enemies wearing matching last names." The chandelier flickered again. Longer this time, casting our shadows across the walls like monsters arriving for judgment. I walked to the fireplace at the end of the dining room. The flames licked low and patient, waiting for something to consume. I held the ledger above the fire, feeling its weight one last time. The heat kissed my knuckles. My family watched in frozen horror. After tonight, I breathed. None of us will ever be the same. And I let it fall. The ledger hit the flames and ignited like it had been soaked in gasoline. Pages curled and blackened. Names dissolved into ash. Secrets turned to smoke. The room filled with the acrid smell of burning guilt. For the first time in generations, the Hale family had no script to follow. Only the truth remained, and the choice of what to do with it. My mother was the first to move. She stood slowly, walked to where I stood by the fire, and took my hand. Her fingers were cold but steady. She said nothing. She didn't need to. One by one, others began to rise. Some left without a word. Some stayed, faces wet with tears they'd held back for years. Clara sat with her head in her hands. Evan stared at the flames like a man watching his empire collapse. Reed drained his glass and set it down with a finality that sounded like surrender. The executor stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather would have hated this," he said quietly. Or perhaps he hoped for it all along. Either way, the choice was always yours. I turned to face him. "What happens now?" "Now," he smiled, a real smile this time, not the practiced mask I'd seen before. "Now you rebuild. Without the ledger. Without the fear. It won't be easy. Some will never forgive you. Some will leave and never return. But at least whatever comes next will be honest." The fire crackled behind me, consuming the last remnants of my grandfather's empire of secrets. The smoke curled up the chimney and disappeared into the night, carrying with it decades of lies. I looked at my mother, at the few who had stayed, at the empty chairs where family used to sit. The house felt different now. Lighter. As if it had been holding its breath for years and could finally exhale. "Then we start tomorrow," I said. "With the truth. And we see who's brave enough to stay." My mother squeezed my hand. The fire burned low. And somewhere in the distance, the house settled with a sound like relief. The Hale legacy had ended tonight. What came next would be something entirely new. Something we'd have to build ourselves, without a ledger to guide us or condemn us. And for the first time since I'd walked through those doors, I felt like I could breathe. If you want to hear more stories about families torn apart by secrets, legacies that become prisons, and the courage it takes to burn it all down and start over, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Because every family has a ledger. The question is, who's brave enough to open it?